The gardener was fired for theft, and the millionaire saw her pendant. The same one she gave her son before he disappeared 22 years ago. Martha Reynolds sat in the grand parlor of her sprawling estate, a place that exuded elegance and wealth. The room was immaculate, with polished oak floors that gleamed under the sunlight streaming through the tall windows. Heavy velvet drapes framed the glass, their deep burgundy color complementing the antique furnishings that filled the space. Yet, amidst all this grandeur, there was an undeniable emptiness in the air, a void that not even the finest luxuries could fill. To the outside world, Martha was a symbol of success and poise. Her name was synonymous with influence, and her mere presence commanded respect. But behind the façade of confidence and control, she was a woman haunted by an unspeakable pain. 22 years ago, during a family trip meant to strengthen bonds, her only son, Caleb, had vanished without a trace. He was just 5 years old at the time, a bright-eyed boy with an infectious laugh and an adventurous spirit. The memory of that day was etched into her soul. An endless loop of questions without answers. Martha's hand instinctively reached for the silver chain around her neck, at the end of which hung a small star-shaped pendant. It was identical to the one she had given Caleb on his 5th birthday, a token of protection and love. The pendant served as her tether to him, a glimmer of hope that somehow, somewhere, he was still out there. The routine of her days had become a well-orchestrated performance, with every moment meticulously planned to keep her mind occupied. Her mornings began with a strong cup of coffee, brewed just the way she liked it, followed by a review of the day's schedule. Today, however, something felt off. As she sat at the table in the conservatory, overlooking the estate's sprawling gardens, she noticed Brandon, the young gardener, hard at work trimming the hedges. Brandon had been employed at the estate for about 6 months. He was quiet, diligent, and unassuming, a stark contrast to the other staff members who often tried to ingratiate themselves with her. Despite his reserved nature, there was something about him that caught her attention. Perhaps it was the way he carried himself, with a quiet confidence that belied his youth, or the meticulous care he put into his work. Whatever it was, she found herself observing him more than she cared to admit. "Madam," a voice interrupted her thoughts. It was Mrs. Thatcher, the estate's head housekeeper. "You have a meeting in an hour with Mr. Simmons to discuss the gala arrangements." "Thank you, Mrs. Thatcher," Martha replied, her tone cool but polite. She set her coffee cup down and rose gracefully from her chair. The day's obligations awaited, and she would meet them with her usual composure, even as the ache in her chest remained a constant companion. By afternoon, the estate was a hive of activity. Staff members bustled about, preparing for an upcoming charity event that Martha was hosting. She walked through the halls, her heels clicking against the marble floors, her presence commanding but detached. She paused at the door to her private study, a room she rarely entered these days. Something compelled her to open it. Inside, the air was heavy with memories, shelves lined with books, a desk neatly arranged with stationery, and a small safe tucked discreetly in the corner. Her eyes lingered on the safe, and a wave of nostalgia washed over her. She hadn't opened it in years. Martha knelt before it, her fingers trembling slightly as she turned the combination lock. When the door clicked open, she reached inside and retrieved a small velvet pouch. Inside was Caleb's star pendant, the twin to the one she wore around her neck. She held it in her hand, the weight of it both comforting and heartbreaking. Her mind drifted back to the day she had given it to him, his laughter filling the room as he clutched it excitedly. A knock at the door pulled her from her reverie. It was Mrs. Thatcher again, her expression unusually stern. "Madam, I need to speak with you. It's about the safe." "What about it?" Martha asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. "One of the items inside. It's missing." Martha's heart stopped. "What do you mean, missing?" "The silver star pendant, Mrs. Thatcher said, "It's not there." Martha glanced down at the pendant in her hand, her mind racing. The twin pendant, the one meant for Caleb. A chill ran down her spine as she tried to make sense of the housekeeper's claim. How could it be missing when she was holding it? Her thoughts were interrupted by the distant sound of Brandon's mower in the gardens. For reasons she couldn't quite explain, her gaze was drawn to the young gardener outside. Unbeknownst to her, this moment would be the catalyst for the unraveling of a mystery she thought would never be solved. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the estate's manicured lawns. Martha paced the length of her study, the velvet pouch still clutched tightly in her hand. The weight of Mrs. Thatcher's words echoed in her mind. The silver star pendant. It's not there. How could it be missing? The safe had been untouched for years, locked securely in a room few dared to enter. Yet, as she stared at the pendant in her hand, identical to the one Caleb had worn, her thoughts churned. Was there another? Or was Mrs. Thatcher mistaken? "Madam, I believe we should investigate immediately," the housekeeper urged from the doorway, her face tight with concern. The staff— "No," Martha interrupted sharply. Her voice carried a finality that made Mrs. Thatcher flinch. "This is not a matter for gossip or speculation. I'll handle it myself." Mrs. Thatcher hesitated but nodded. "As you wish, madam." As the housekeeper retreated, Martha sank into the leather armchair by the desk. Her hand trembled as she placed the pendant on the polished wood surface. Something was amiss, and she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this wasn't a simple misunderstanding. Moments later, a light knock broke her thoughts. It was Stevens, the butler, with his usual air of composed efficiency. "Madam, I was told to inform you that there's been an incident involving Mr. Brandon," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Brandon," Martha frowned. "What sort of incident?" Stevens hesitated, choosing his words with care. "Mrs. Thatcher believes he may have taken something from the safe." Martha's eyes widened. "What exactly are you implying?" "The missing item, madam. She claims to have seen something similar on his person earlier today." The accusation hit her like a blow. Brandon, the quiet, unassuming gardener who had barely spoken more than a few words to her since his arrival. It seemed absurd. Yet, the thought of the pendant missing and the coincidental timing gnawed at her. "Bring him to me," she ordered, her voice calm but firm. Minutes later, Brandon appeared at the study door, his face pale but composed. He stood awkwardly, dirt still clinging to his work boots and the cuffs of his jeans. His hands fidgeted with the brim of his hat as he avoided meeting her gaze. "You asked to see me, ma'am," he said softly. Martha studied him closely, searching for signs of guilt. "Yes, I was told you may have taken something from my safe." Brandon's brow furrowed in confusion. "Your safe? I don't even know where that is." "That may be true," she said, her tone laced with suspicion. "But Mrs. Thatcher claims to have seen you wearing a pendant resembling one that's gone missing. Would you care to explain that?" For the first time, Brandon seemed genuinely rattled. His hand instinctively went to his chest, where a silver chain glinted against his collarbone. Pulling it free, he revealed a small, star-shaped pendant. "This?" he asked, his voice incredulous. "This is mine. I've had it since I was a kid." The sight of the pendant struck Martha like lightning. It was identical to the one she had just held in her hand. Her breath caught as she leaned forward. "Where did you get that?" she demanded. Her voice trembling. "I don't know," Brandon admitted, his eyes clouding with confusion. "It's the only thing I had when they found me in Chicago. I grew up in an orphanage, and this was all I had with me." Martha's heart pounded in her chest. "Who found you? When?" "I was about 5 years old," he said, his voice quieter now. "The authorities said someone dropped me off at a hospital. I don't remember much before that, just flashes, faces, maybe a car. Nothing makes sense." The words sent a chill down Martha's spine. 5 years old, Chicago, an orphanage. She stared at him, her mind racing. Could it be? Could this young man standing before her, this quiet, diligent gardener, truly be her Caleb? Her throat tightened, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. The room seemed to close in around her as decades of grief and unanswered questions pressed down on her shoulders. "Why didn't you mention this before?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Brandon shrugged, his expression wary. "I didn't think it mattered. It's just a necklace to me. Something I've always had." Martha leaned back in her chair, the pendant on her desk gleaming under the lamplight. It was too much to be a coincidence. But could she risk believing it? Could she allow herself to hope, after all these years, that her son might be standing right in front of her? "Brandon," she said softly, her voice steadying, "I need to ask something of you." "Anything, ma'am," he replied, though there was an edge of caution in his tone. "I want a DNA test," she said, her gaze locking with his. "If there's even the slightest chance that you are who I think you are, I need to know." Brandon blinked, stunned. "Who you think I am?" Martha's lips trembled, but she held his gaze. "My son." The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves outside the window. Brandon stared at her. Confusion and disbelief etched across his face. "I'll do it," he said finally, his voice barely audible. And with those words, the fragile walls around Martha's guarded heart began to crack. The following morning dawned gray and somber, with clouds hanging low over the Reynolds estate. Martha sat at the head of the long dining table, staring blankly at the untouched breakfast laid out before her. Her appetite had vanished, replaced by a nervous energy that coiled tightly in her chest. The events of the previous evening played over in her mind like a reel of film, each moment sharpening her growing sense of unease and hope. Brandon had agreed to the DNA test, but now she faced a harrowing wait for the results. She had sent for the family doctor, Dr. Aldridge, who discreetly collected samples from both her and Brandon early that morning. The process had been efficient and clinical, but Martha couldn't ignore the flicker of bewilderment in the doctor's eyes when she explained her suspicions. "You're sure about this, Mrs. Reynolds?" he had asked cautiously. "No, I'm not," Martha replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "But I need to be." Now, as the hours stretched on, Martha struggled to distract herself. The mansion buzzed with activity as preparations for the upcoming charity gala continued. But even the rhythmic hum of life within its walls couldn't quell her thoughts. Her gaze drifted toward the gardens, where Brandon was already at work. As if nothing had changed, she wondered how he could remain so composed. While she felt as though her world was on the verge of tilting, her contemplation was interrupted by the sharp click of heels on the marble floor. Mrs. Thatcher appeared in the doorway, her expression neutral but her hands fidgeting, a telltale sign of her discomfort. "Madam," the housekeeper began, "may I speak with you privately?" Martha nodded, gesturing for her to enter. Mrs. Thatcher stepped forward, her usual stern demeanor softened by an undercurrent of unease. "It's about Mr. Brandon," she said cautiously. "I wanted to apologize for the accusations made yesterday. I acted hastily and—" Martha held up a hand, silencing her. "I understand, Mrs. Thatcher. You acted on instinct, but this matter is more complicated than you realize." Mrs. Thatcher hesitated, clearly torn between curiosity and propriety. "If I may, madam, what is it that you suspect?" Martha's lips pressed into a thin line. She wasn't ready to share her suspicions. "Not yet. That will be all for now, Mrs. Thatcher. Thank you." The housekeeper dipped her head and retreated, leaving Martha alone with her thoughts once more. She rose from her seat and moved toward the window, her eyes following Brandon's movements as he meticulously trimmed the hedges. There was an ease to his work, a quiet focus that belied the magnitude of what they were waiting to uncover. Unable to resist, Martha stepped outside, the cool morning air brushing against her skin. She approached Brandon slowly, her heels crunching softly on the gravel path. He glanced up as she neared, his expression guarded but polite. "Ma'am," he said, pausing his work. "Is there something you need?" Martha hesitated, searching for the right words. "I wanted to thank you for agreeing to the test. I know this isn't easy," Brandon shrugged, wiping his hands on a rag tucked into his pocket. "I guess I just want answers as much as you do." She nodded, her gaze lingering on him. In the daylight, she noticed details she hadn't before. The strong line of his jaw, the flecks of gold in his hazel eyes, traits that stirred something deep within her. A faint but insistent whisper of familiarity. "Do you remember anything?" she asked tentatively. "About your childhood, before the orphanage?" Brandon frowned, his brow furrowing in concentration. "Not much," he admitted. "Just bits and pieces. I remember a party, lights, music, and a man, but I can't see his face. I think he was shouting." Martha's breath hitched. A party. Caleb's disappearance had occurred during a family gathering, the estate filled with guests and noise. Her heart pounded as she pressed further. "Anything else? A name? A place?" Brandon shook his head, frustration flickering across his face. "It's all blurry, like trying to grab smoke." She nodded, unwilling to push him further. "Thank you, Brandon. If you remember anything, let me know." He nodded, his expression unreadable as he returned to his work. Martha lingered for a moment before turning back toward the house. Her mind raced with questions, each one more unsettling than the last. If Brandon truly was Caleb, how had he ended up in Chicago, so far from home? And who was the man in his fragmented memory? The day crawled by, each hour stretching interminably. By late afternoon, the estate fell into a hushed lull as the staff took their midday break. Martha retreated to her study, seeking solace in the familiarity of her surroundings. She opened a drawer and pulled out an old photo album, its leather cover worn from years of handling. Flipping through its pages, she paused at a picture of Caleb on his 5th birthday. He was beaming, clutching the star pendant she had given him. The sight of his joyful face brought a lump to her throat. A soft knock broke her reverie. It was Dr. Aldridge, holding a sealed envelope. "The results, Mrs. Reynolds," he said quietly, placing the envelope on her desk. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, her pulse roaring in her ears. She hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. With a deep breath, she tore it open and scanned the contents. Her vision blurred as the words leapt off the page. 99% probability of maternity. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she clutched the paper to her chest. It was true. Brandon was Caleb. Her son had come home. The revelation that Brandon was Caleb rippled through Martha's mind like a tidal wave. For 22 years, she had carried the weight of his absence, clinging to the faintest hope that he might still be alive. Now that hope had transformed into reality, yet it brought with it a flood of questions and emotions she was unprepared to face. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the estate in shades of amber and shadow, Martha found herself pacing the length of her study. Her fingers absently traced the edges of the DNA results, the paper still trembling slightly in her grasp. She knew she couldn't keep this discovery to herself any longer. Caleb deserved to know the truth. Steeling herself, she left the study and made her way to the gardens, where she knew Brandon, Caleb, she corrected herself, would still be. She found him kneeling in the dirt, carefully replanting a row of hydrangeas. The sight tugged at her heart. This young man, so unassuming and diligent, had once been her bright, carefree child. "Brandon," she called softly, her voice catching in her throat. He looked up, his brow furrowing slightly at her expression. "Ma'am, is everything all right?" She took a deep breath, willing herself to remain composed. "Can we talk inside?" His hesitation was brief, but she caught it, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes before he nodded and rose to his feet. Together, they walked back to the mansion in silence, the tension between them palpable. Once inside, Martha led him to the drawing room, a space rarely used except for intimate family moments. It felt appropriate, though the irony of that wasn't lost on her. She gestured for him to sit while she remained standing, her fingers clasped tightly in front of her. "I've received the results of the DNA test," she began, her voice steady but soft. "And I need you to hear this directly from me." Brandon sat stiffly, his expression unreadable. "All right?" Martha's breath wavered as she spoke the words aloud. "You're my son, Caleb." For a moment, the room seemed to freeze. Brandon stared at her, his eyes wide with shock. "What?" "The test confirmed it," she continued, her voice thick with emotion. "You're the child I lost 22 years ago." Brandon's hands gripped the arms of the chair, his knuckles turning white. I don't even know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Martha said, taking a step closer. "I know this must feel overwhelming. It does for me too. But you are my son, Caleb, and I need you to know how much I've missed you." The vulnerability in her voice seemed to soften something in Brandon. He looked down at his hands, his shoulders sagging slightly. "I don't remember anything," he admitted. "I've tried, but it's all just pieces, flashes." Martha nodded, swallowing back her own tears. "That's all right. Whatever you can remember, we'll work through it together." For the first time he looked at her, really looked at her, as though trying to find traces of himself in her features. "There are some things," he said slowly. "Not much, but they've been in my head for as long as I can remember." Martha sat beside him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Tell me." Brandon closed his eyes, his brows knitting together as he reached for the fragments of memory buried deep within. "There was a party," he began. "I remember lights, music, and people everywhere. I was happy. But then something happened." "What happened?" Martha prompted gently. "There was a man," he continued, his voice tightening. "I don't know who he was, but he grabbed me. I remember yelling, being pulled away. It was dark and I was scared." Martha's chest tightened. She reached for his hand instinctively, her touch light but reassuring. "Do you remember anything about the man? His face? His voice?" Brandon shook his head. "It's all blurry, like it's just out of reach." The frustration in his tone mirrored the ache in Martha's heart. "It's all right," she said softly. "We'll figure it out, together." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the shared revelation settling between them. Finally, Brandon spoke again. "Why now? After all this time? Why did it have to come out like this?" Martha's lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't have an answer for that," she admitted. "But I do know that finding you now, no matter how it happened, is a gift I thought I'd never have." Brandon nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the floor. "It's just a lot to process." "I know," Martha said, her voice steady. "Take all the time you need. But please, know that this is your home now. You are my son, and nothing will ever change that." As the evening wore on, Martha couldn't help but feel a cautious optimism blooming within her. She had found her son. Against all odds, she had him back. But beneath the joy was a growing sense of unease. The pieces of Brandon's fragmented memories hinted at something darker, something unresolved. The man who had taken Caleb from her wasn't just a shadow of the past. He was the key to understanding everything, and perhaps the threat that still loomed over them both. The following day was heavy with anticipation. The air inside the Reynolds mansion seemed thicker, almost suffocating, as though the house itself knew the weight of the truths that had surfaced. Martha spent the morning avoiding everyone, retreating to her study to sift through old photo albums and mementos of Caleb's childhood. Each image was a reminder of the bright, curious boy she had lost, and the young man, now a stranger, who had returned to her. Meanwhile, Brandon, or Caleb, as she was still hesitant to call him out loud, wandered the estate aimlessly. The revelation from the previous night clung to him like a second skin, impossible to shake. Every corner of the property felt unfamiliar, yet oddly comforting, like a faint memory he couldn't quite grasp. His mind raced with questions. How could he have been Caleb all this time and never known? And more troubling, who had taken him, and why? By midday, Martha resolved to address the staff. She knew the household would be buzzing with whispers, and she wanted to put an end to the speculation before it spiraled out of control. She gathered them in the main hall, where the grand chandelier cast fractured light across the polished floor. "I have an announcement to make," she began, her voice steady but firm. "As many of you are aware, there was a development regarding Brandon." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the curious faces before her. "Brandon is in fact my son, Caleb. The DNA results have confirmed it." A murmur rippled through the small crowd. Some exchanged startled glances, while others, like Mrs. Thatcher, appeared skeptical. Martha raised a hand to quiet them. "This discovery changes everything, and yet it changes nothing. Caleb has always been part of this household, even when we didn't know who he truly was. I expect each of you to treat him with the respect and kindness you've always shown. Do I make myself clear?" The murmurs ceased, replaced by nods of agreement. Martha dismissed the group and turned to find Brandon standing at the edge of the hall, his expression unreadable. She walked over to him, her heels clicking softly against the floor. "Was that really necessary?" he asked quietly. Martha studied him, noting the tension in his posture. "It was. This is your home, and they needed to understand that." Brandon looked away, his jaw tightening. "It still doesn't feel like home." "It will," Martha said gently. "Give it time." But time wasn't the only thing they needed. There were still too many unanswered questions, and Martha was determined to find the answers. She had already reached out to a private investigator, an old contact she trusted implicitly, to dig into Brandon's past. The fragments of his memories were a start, but they weren't enough. She needed the whole picture, no matter how painful it might be. Later that evening, Martha invited Brandon to join her in the library, a room he hadn't yet explored. It was a grand space, with towering shelves filled with leather-bound volumes and a crackling fireplace that cast a warm glow over the room. She handed him a glass of brandy, hoping the gesture might ease the awkwardness that still lingered between them. "I wanted to show you something," she said, retrieving a small, weathered photo album from the side table. She placed it on the coffee table and flipped it open to the first page. Brandon leaned forward, his eyes scanning the images. There he was, a little boy with a wide smile, holding a toy train in one hand and a chocolate bar in the other. His breath hitched as he stared at the photo, a faint flicker of recognition sparking in his eyes. "That's me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Martha nodded, her heart aching at the vulnerability in his tone. "You loved that train set. You wouldn't go anywhere without it." Brandon reached out, his fingers brushing the edge of the photo. "I think I remember. The sound it made when the wheels turned. It squeaked, didn't it?" A smile broke through Martha's solemn expression. "It did. You used to drive everyone mad with it." For the first time, Brandon laughed, a soft, tentative sound that filled the room like sunlight breaking through clouds. It was fleeting, but in that moment, Martha felt a glimmer of the bond she had feared was lost forever as they turned the pages together. More fragments of memory surfaced. Brandon recalled a birthday party with balloons shaped like animals, a trip to the zoo where he'd been mesmerized by the lions, and a day at the beach when he'd built a sandcastle that collapsed under the tide. Each recollection was like a puzzle piece slotting into place, forming a picture that had been shattered for too long. But not all the memories were happy. When they reached a photo from the night of the family party, the night Caleb disappeared, Brandon's hand froze. His eyes narrowed as he stared at the image, his jaw tightening. "That's it," he said suddenly. "That's the party," Martha's breath caught. "You remember?" Brandon nodded, his expression darkening. "I remember the lights, the music, and him." "Who?" Martha pressed, her voice urgent. "The man," Brandon said, his voice low. "The one who took me. I can't see his face, but he was there. He grabbed me. And there was a car. I don't know what happened after that." Martha felt her stomach churn. The faint hope she'd carried was now tinged with dread. The man who had stolen her son was no longer just a shadow of the past. He was real, and somewhere out there, he might still be watching. The weight of Brandon's revelation lingered in the air long after their conversation had ended. Martha remained in the library, staring at the photo album spread open on the coffee table. Her fingers traced the edges of the photograph from the fateful night Caleb had vanished. Her heart ached, torn between relief that her son had returned and the haunting realization that his disappearance had been anything but random. Upstairs, Brandon sat on the edge of the guest room bed, a room that had once been a playroom for the child he couldn't remember being. The walls were bare now, stripped of their former life, but there was a faint outline where a mural of stars and planets had once been painted. It was another piece of a life that felt both foreign and frustratingly close. His thoughts churned. Every time he tried to focus on the fragments of memory, they slipped away like water through his fingers. The man, the car, the party. It was all too blurry. He clenched his fists, the pressure building in his chest. Downstairs, Martha picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in years. The line clicked, and a gruff voice answered. "Martha Reynolds," the voice said, his tone carrying a note of surprise. "It's been a long time." "Too long, Mr. Carter," she replied, her voice steady. "I need your help." The next morning, Mr. Carter arrived at the estate. He was a seasoned private investigator, his demeanor no nonsense, and his appearance just as sharp as Martha remembered. He stepped into the study, where Martha had gathered all the photos and documents she thought might be relevant. "I appreciate you coming on such short notice," Martha said, as she gestured for him to sit. He nodded, his eyes scanning the materials on the desk. "You wouldn't have called me if it wasn't important." "It's about my son, Caleb," she began, her voice faltering slightly. "He's alive." Carter raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, allowing her to continue. "For 22 years, I believed he was gone, and now he's back. But his memories are fragmented, and the circumstances of his disappearance remain a mystery." She slid a photo across the desk toward him. "This was taken the night he vanished. He mentioned remembering a man who took him." Carter studied the photo, his expression unreadable. "Do you have any leads? Anything that could point us in a direction?" "Only fragments," Martha admitted. but he recalls a car and being taken from the estate that night. The investigator leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing in thought. I'll need to speak with him. Sometimes even the smallest details can make all the difference. Martha hesitated but nodded. I'll arrange it. Later that afternoon, Brandon sat across from Carter in the sunlit conservatory. The investigator's piercing gaze made him shift uncomfortably in his seat, but he answered the man's questions as best he could. You said you remember a car? Carter prompted. Can you describe it? Anything at all? Brandon frowned, closing his eyes as he searched his fragmented memories. It was dark, big. I think there was a smell, like oil or gasoline, and there was music playing. Something loud. Carter nodded, jotting notes in his leather-bound notebook. And the man, Brandon's face tightened. I don't know. I can't see his face. Just his hands. He had a ring on one of them, I think. And his voice. He was shouting at someone, but I couldn't understand what he was saying. The investigator's pen paused mid-stroke. A ring, he asked, his tone sharper now. What kind of ring? Brandon shook his head. I don't know. It was big, maybe gold. Carter leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. Anything else? Think carefully. Brandon let out a frustrated sigh. That's all I've got. It's more than enough to start, Carter said, closing his notebook with a snap. I'll dig into the guest list from that night and see what I can uncover. As the days passed, the tension in the house grew palpable. Martha tried to carry on with her usual routines, but her mind was consumed by the investigation. Brandon, too, struggled to find a sense of normalcy. Every time he walked through the estate, he was hit with fleeting moments of recognition. A staircase, a window seat, the old oak tree in the garden, but they brought more frustration than comfort. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Brandon wandered into the library. He found Martha seated by the fire, a book resting unopened in her lap. She looked up as he entered, offering him a faint smile. Couldn't sleep? She asked. He shook his head and sat in the chair opposite her for a moment. Neither of them spoke, the crackling of the fire filling the silence. It's strange, Brandon said finally. Being here feels right, but at the same time it doesn't. Does that make sense? Martha nodded, her expression softening. It does. You've been through so much, Caleb. It's going to take time. He flinched slightly at the name, still unaccustomed to hearing it. Do you ever think about what might have happened if I hadn't been taken? Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. Every day, she admitted, but I can't dwell on that anymore. You're here now, and that's what matters. Before either of them could say more, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed in the hall. Carter appeared in the doorway, his face grim. I've found something, he announced, his voice low, and I think you're going to want to see it. Martha and Brandon followed Carter to the study, the air between them charged with anticipation and unease. The investigator carried a manila folder tucked under his arm, his movements brisk and deliberate. Once inside, he placed the folder on the desk and gestured for them to sit. What I've found is only the beginning, Carter began, his gravelly voice cutting through the silence. But it paints a troubling picture. He opened the folder, revealing a series of photographs and documents. Martha leaned forward, her breath catching as she recognized the Reynolds estate in one of the images. The photograph was old, slightly grainy, and showed the driveway packed with cars from the night of the party. I tracked down the guest list from that evening, Carter continued, sliding a list across the desk. There were nearly 100 people in attendance, but a handful of names stand out. Martha scanned the list, her eyes narrowing. These names, why do they stand out? Carter tapped the page with his pen. 2 of them have connections to organized crime, minor players, but involved nonetheless. And then there's this name, Raymond Reynolds. The blood drained from Martha's face. Raymond, she whispered, her voice laced with disbelief. My brother. Carter nodded grimly. He was listed as one of the hosts of the event according to the records. He arranged for additional security that evening, though there's no clear reason why. Martha's mind reeled. Raymond had always been an ambitious and cunning man, but she couldn't fathom the idea of him being involved in Caleb's disappearance. There must be some mistake, she said, her voice shaking. Raymond wouldn't... I'm not accusing him directly, Carter interrupted, but his name keeps coming up. He also made a substantial cash withdrawal the day after Caleb disappeared, $15,000, no record of where it went. Brandon, who had been silent until now, leaned forward. What does this mean? Are you saying he might have had something to do with it? It's too early to draw conclusions, Carter said carefully. But it's worth investigating. Martha's heart pounded. Memories of Raymond flashed through her mind. His charm, his confidence, the way he always seemed to be one step ahead of everyone else. Could he have been hiding something all these years? I'll need to speak with him, Carter continued. Discreetly, if he's involved, we can't risk tipping him off. Martha nodded numbly. Do whatever you need to do. The following day, Carter arranged a meeting with Raymond at a downtown cafe, choosing a public but quiet setting. Raymond arrived impeccably dressed, his tailored suit and confident stride exuding the charisma he was known for. He greeted Carter with a firm handshake and a polite smile, oblivious to the investigator's true purpose. You said you wanted to discuss a family matter, Raymond asked as they settled into their seats. Carter nodded, his expression neutral. Yes, it concerns the night of the party 22 years ago. Raymond's smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. That was a long time ago. What's this about? It's about Caleb, Carter said bluntly. He's alive. Raymond's reaction was subtle but telling. His eyes widened for a fraction of a second before narrowing. Alive, that's unexpected and wonderful, of course. Carter leaned forward, his tone casual but probing. I've been looking into the events of that night, and your name has come up several times. You arranged for additional security, didn't you? Raymond shrugged. As a precaution, we had a lot of guests, and I didn't want to take any chances. And the cash withdrawal the next day, Carter pressed. $15,000 is quite a precaution. Raymond's smile thinned. You've been digging, haven't you? I admire your thoroughness, but you're barking up the wrong tree. That money went to pay a contractor for renovations on my townhouse. Conveniently undocumented, Carter remarked, his tone sharp. And coincidentally timed. Raymond's expression darkened. If you're accusing me of something, say it outright. I'm not accusing you of anything, Carter replied smoothly. I'm simply trying to connect the dots. Raymond stood abruptly, tossing a few bills onto the table. This conversation is over. If you have more questions, I suggest you take them up with my lawyer. As Raymond stormed out, Carter remained seated, his expression unreadable. He had struck a nerve. Of that, he was certain. But whether Raymond's reaction stemmed from guilt or frustration was still unclear. Back at the mansion, Martha paced the length of her study, her anxiety growing with each passing hour. When Carter returned and relayed the details of his meeting, her stomach churned. He's hiding something, Carter concluded. I can feel it. Martha's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the desk. What do we do now? We keep digging, Carter said firmly. I'll focus on the money trail and see if it leads anywhere. In the meantime, be cautious around him. If he's involved, he won't take kindly to us getting too close to the truth. As Carter left, Martha sank into her chair, her mind racing. The idea that her own brother might have played a role in Caleb's disappearance was unthinkable. But so was everything else about this ordeal. She glanced at the photo of young Caleb on her desk, his bright smile a painful reminder of the innocence that had been stolen from him. Upstairs, Brandon stared out his window, his thoughts equally troubled. He couldn't shake the feeling that the answers they were searching for were right in front of them, just out of reach. But with each passing day, the shadows of the past grew darker, and the man in his fragmented memories loomed larger. For the first time, he felt not just confusion, but anger. Whoever had taken him had stolen not only his childhood, but his sense of self. And if Raymond was involved, he would find out. No matter what it took, the revelation that Raymond could be implicated in Caleb's disappearance sent shockwaves through the Reynolds estate. Martha struggled to reconcile the possibility that her own brother, someone she had trusted implicitly, might have been complicit in the most devastating event of her life. Meanwhile, Brandon wrestled with his fragmented memories and the unease of being thrust into a family he barely recognized. Martha spent the morning in her private quarters, her mind spinning with doubts and questions. How could Raymond, the charming and supportive brother she had known all her life, have harbored such a dark secret? And if he truly was involved, Why? What could he possibly gain from taking Caleb away from her? Downstairs, the household buzzed with subdued tension. The staff had picked up on the strained atmosphere but knew better than to ask questions. Brandon, however, felt the weight of their whispers. As he worked in the garden, he could sense the curious glances and hushed conversations. For someone who had always preferred to remain in the background, the sudden attention was both unsettling and infuriating. By midday, Brandon decided he needed answers. He wiped his hands on a towel and headed toward the house. Determined to confront Martha about her suspicions, he found her in the conservatory, staring blankly at a vase of freshly cut roses. "Can we talk?" he asked, his tone tentative but firm. Martha looked up, startled. She nodded, gesturing for him to sit. "Of course, what's on your mind?" Brandon hesitated, his hands clenching and unclenching as he searched for the right words. "It's about Raymond. Carter thinks he's hiding something, doesn't he?" Martha's expression tightened. "He does," she admitted. "But we don't have enough evidence yet." Brandon frowned. "You think he had something to do with what happened to me?" The raw vulnerability in his voice broke something inside Martha. She reached across the table, placing her hand gently over his. "I don't want to believe it, Caleb, but there are too many questions that only he can answer." Brandon's jaw tightened. "He's your brother. How could he? How could anyone in your family do something like that?" Martha's throat tightened as she struggled to find an explanation. "I don't know, but I promise you we'll uncover the truth." Her words did little to soothe the storm brewing inside him. Brandon rose abruptly, pacing the room. "It just doesn't make sense," he muttered. "Why take me? Why now, after all these years? Am I only finding out who I am?" Martha stood, her voice gentle but resolute. "We'll get to the bottom of it, Caleb, but you have to trust me." He turned to face her, his eyes dark with frustration. "I don't even know who I am anymore. You call me Caleb, but I've been Brandon my whole life. I feel like I'm stuck between two people, and I don't know which one is real." Martha stepped closer, her heart aching at his turmoil. "You are both, my son, and we'll figure out what that means together." That evening, Martha decided it was time to confront Raymond directly. She invited him to dinner, framing it as a casual family gathering. He arrived promptly, his usual charm on full display, but Martha noticed a flicker of unease in his eyes as he stepped into the dining room. The table was set impeccably, with crystal glasses and fine china gleaming under the chandelier's soft light. Brandon sat across from Raymond, his gaze steady but guarded. The tension was palpable, though Martha maintained her composed demeanor. "I must say, it's been a while since we've had a family dinner like this," Raymond remarked, raising his glass of wine. "It's a welcome change." Martha forced a smile. "Indeed, it's good to catch up." As the meal progressed, the conversation remained polite but superficial. Brandon barely spoke, his eyes fixed on Raymond with a quiet intensity. Martha waited until the dessert was served before steering the conversation toward the past. "Do you remember the party we hosted 22 years ago?" she asked casually, cutting into her tart. Raymond paused, his fork hovering midair. "Of course," he replied smoothly. "It was quite the event. Do you remember anything unusual happening that night?" she pressed, her tone light but probing. Raymond's smile faltered. "Unusual? No, not particularly. Why do you ask?" Martha set her fork down, meeting his gaze directly. "Because Caleb disappeared that night, and now he's back." Raymond's expression froze for a fraction of a second before he recovered. "Yes, I heard the news. It's remarkable." "Really? A miracle?" Brandon, unable to contain himself any longer, leaned forward. "Do you know anything about what happened to me?" he asked bluntly. Raymond feigned surprise. "Me? Of course not. Why would you think that?" "Because Carter found records of a large cash withdrawal you made the day after the party," Martha interjected, her voice steady. $15,000, Raymond. Care to explain?" Raymond's smile turned brittle. "That was for renovations on my townhouse, as I told your investigator." "Without any documentation," Brandon challenged, his voice sharp. Raymond's eyes narrowed. "Are you accusing me of something?" "Boy, I'm accusing you of lying," Brandon shot back. "That's enough," Martha said, her voice cutting through the tension. She turned to Raymond, her expression cold. "If you have nothing to hide, then prove it. Show us the records. Clear your name." Raymond stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I don't have to explain myself to you. I won't stand here and be accused of something so outrageous." With that, he stormed out, leaving Martha and Brandon in stunned silence. The sound of the front door slamming echoed through the house. Martha exhaled slowly, her composure finally cracking. "He's hiding something," she murmured, more to herself than to Brandon. Brandon clenched his fists, his frustration bubbling over. "Then we need to stop waiting and start acting." Martha nodded, her resolve hardening. "We will, one way or another. We'll uncover the truth." The days following Raymond's abrupt departure were filled with tension. His reaction at the dinner had only deepened Martha's and Brandon's suspicions. Though no direct evidence tied him to Caleb's disappearance, his evasiveness and defensiveness painted a damning picture. Martha spent hours in her study, poring over old documents, party records, and any correspondence she could find from that time. She hoped to uncover a clue, some piece of evidence that might shed light on Raymond's involvement. Meanwhile, Carter continued his investigation, delving deeper into financial transactions and connections to the guests who had attended the party. Brandon, however, couldn't sit still. Frustration gnawed at him, and the weight of his fragmented memories pressed harder with each passing day. He took to spending long hours in the gardens, using the physical labor as a way to process his thoughts. The once familiar tasks now felt distant, like the life of Brandon was slowly fading, leaving space for Caleb, a name he still struggled to fully embrace. One evening, as Martha sorted through an old box of papers in the attic, she came across a letter addressed to her. The envelope was yellowed with age, its edges frayed. The handwriting was unmistakably Raymond's. Her hands trembled as she slid the letter out, unfolding it carefully. The letter was dated 2 weeks after Caleb's disappearance. As she read, her stomach churned. "Dear Martha, I know this is an unimaginable time for you, but I want you to know that I'm here for you, always. I've made arrangements to handle some pressing family matters, things that I don't want you to worry about right now. Trust me when I say I'm doing everything I can to protect our family's future. Yours always, Raymond." The words were vague, but in light of recent events, they carried a sinister undertone. What pressing family matters could he have been referring to? And why had he never mentioned this letter before? Martha clutched the paper tightly, her mind racing. She needed to confront him again, but not without a plan. She picked up her phone and called Carter. "I found something," she said, her voice low but urgent. "It's a letter from Raymond. I need you to come to the house." Carter arrived within the hour, his notebook in hand. Martha showed him the letter, and he read it carefully, his brow furrowing. "This could be important," he said, setting it down. "But it's not enough on its own. We need more. Can we use this to pressure him?" Martha asked. Carter shook his head. "Not yet. If he senses we're closing in, he might cover his tracks. Or worse, disappear entirely. Let me dig a little deeper first." Martha nodded reluctantly. Though her patience was wearing thin, every day without answers felt like a betrayal of the years she had spent mourning Caleb. Meanwhile, Brandon had begun to explore the estate more deliberately, hoping to jog his memory. He found himself drawn to the old guest house at the edge of the property, a building that had been unused for years. The windows were boarded up, and the door hung slightly ajar, creaking with every gust of wind. Pushing the door open, Brandon stepped inside. Dust motes floated in the dim light, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew. The space was sparse, with only a few pieces of furniture covered in white sheets. But something about the room felt unsettlingly familiar. As he wandered through the small space, a sudden flash of memory hit him. He saw himself, small, frightened, being pulled through the guest house by a man whose face remained obscured. The man's voice echoed faintly in his mind. "Keep quiet and no one will get hurt." Brandon stumbled back, gripping the edge of a table for support. His heart raced as the memory faded, leaving him with more questions than answers. He rushed back to the mansion, finding Martha in the study. "I remembered something," he said breathlessly. Martha looked up, startled. "What is it?" "The guest house," Brandon said, his voice urgent. "I think I was taken there before everything happened." Martha's face paled. "The guest house, are you sure?" Brandon nodded. "I can't explain it, but I remember being there. Someone was pulling me through it." Martha rose from her chair, her mind racing. "We need to tell Carter." Carter returned the next morning, and the three of them headed to the guest house together. The investigator examined the space carefully, his sharp eyes scanning every corner. After several minutes, he paused near the fireplace, crouching down to inspect something hidden in the dust. "What is it?" Martha asked, her voice tight with anticipation. Carter held up a small tarnished object. It was a cufflink, gold with an engraved monogram. R.R. Martha's breath caught. "Raymond." Carter nodded grimly. "It's not definitive proof, but it places him here. Combined with Brandon's memory and the letter, it's enough to warrant a deeper look." The discovery of the cufflink reignited Martha's determination. She began to piece together the fragments of evidence they had gathered. The letter, the cash withdrawal, Raymond's defensiveness, and now the cufflink. It all pointed to a man she had trusted implicitly, a man who now seemed to be at the center of the mystery. For Brandon, the visit to the guest house stirred conflicting emotions. The faint memory of being dragged through its dusty halls filled him with both fear and anger. Whoever had taken him had stolen more than just years of his life. They had stolen his sense of security, his identity. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he made a silent vow. No matter how difficult or painful it was, he would uncover the truth. He owed it to himself, and to the family he was only beginning to rediscover. The discovery of the cufflink sent a shockwave through Martha's fragile sense of stability. It felt like the final crack in the carefully constructed façade of trust she had maintained with her brother. If Raymond's cufflink had been at the guest house, what other secrets had he left behind? The following morning, Martha sat in her study, the cufflink resting on the desk in front of her. Her fingers traced the engraved RR, her mind spinning with possibilities. The guest house had been untouched for years. There was no plausible explanation for its presence there, unless Raymond had been involved in Caleb's disappearance. A knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. Carter stepped inside, his expression serious but focused. "I've dug deeper into Raymond's financials," he began, setting a folder on the desk. The cash withdrawal was just the beginning. Over the next few months after Caleb's disappearance, there were several large transactions to shell companies. They're difficult to trace, but I managed to link one of them to a known fixer. Someone who specializes in making problems disappear? Martha's heart sank. "You're saying he paid someone to take Caleb?" Carter nodded grimly. "It's starting to look that way." That evening, Martha invited Raymond to the estate under the pretense of discussing family matters. She knew it was a risk. If he suspected she was onto him, he might try to flee. But she needed answers, and she was determined to get them. When Raymond arrived, he was his usual charming self, greeting Martha with a warm smile and a kiss on the cheek. But his confidence faltered when he noticed the tension in her posture and the hard set of her expression. "Martha, you look like you've seen a ghost," he joked, taking a seat in the parlor. "What's this about?" Martha didn't waste time with pleasantries. She picked up the cufflink from the side table and held it out to him. "Do you recognize this?" Raymond's eyes flickered with something. Surprise, fear. It was gone in an instant, replaced by a casual smile. "Of course, it's mine. Where did you find it?" "In the guest house," Martha replied coldly. "The same guest house Brandon remembers being taken to the night Caleb disappeared." Raymond's smile tightened. "I haven't been in that guest house in years. You know that." "Then how do you explain this?" Martha demanded, her voice rising. "How do you explain the cash withdrawals, the fixer you paid, the letter you sent me about pressing family matters? Tell me the truth, Raymond. Did you take my son?" Raymond's expression darkened, his charm evaporating. "You're making accusations without proof, Martha. Be careful." "Proof," Martha shot back, her anger bubbling to the surface. "How much more proof do I need? You've lied to me, to this family. I trusted you, and now I find out you've been hiding something all these years." Raymond stood abruptly, his face a mask of controlled fury. "You don't know what you're talking about, and if you think you can pin this on me, you're sorely mistaken." As he moved to leave, Brandon appeared in the doorway. He had been listening from the hall, his fists clenched at his sides. "Where were you that night?" Brandon demanded, his voice shaking with restrained anger. "What did you do to me?" Raymond froze, his eyes darting between Brandon and Martha. For a moment, the room was silent. the weight of the confrontation hanging heavy in the air. "I did what I had to do," Raymond said finally, his voice cold. "You don't understand the pressure I was under." "What pressure?" Martha demanded. "What could possibly justify taking a child from his mother?" Raymond exhaled sharply, his composure cracking. The family business was failing. There were debts, dangerous debts. "I thought if I removed you from the picture, I could take control of the estate and fix everything. But Caleb was in the way. I didn't plan for it to happen like this. It was supposed to be simpler." Brandon's jaw tightened, his body trembling with anger. "You ruined my life," he said through gritted teeth. "You stole everything from me." Raymond's gaze hardened. "I did what I thought was best for the family." "For the family," Martha echoed, her voice breaking. "You destroyed this family." The room fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by the sound of Martha's unsteady breathing. She turned to Carter, who had been standing quietly in the corner, observing the exchange. "Is that enough for you?" she asked, her voice trembling. Carter nodded. "More than enough. I'll contact the authorities," as Raymond was escorted out of the house in handcuffs later that evening. Martha stood in the doorway, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Brandon stood beside her, his expression unreadable. "I don't even know what to feel," he admitted quietly. "Anger, sadness, relief. It's all just too much." Martha placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip firm but comforting. "You don't have to figure it all out tonight. We'll take it one step at a time." Brandon nodded, though the weight of everything remained heavy on his shoulders. As the police car carrying Raymond disappeared down the drive, he let out a shaky breath. "Do you think this is really over?" he asked. Martha hesitated, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I don't know, but at least now we have the truth." That night, as the estate fell into an uneasy quiet, Martha sat alone in the study, the flickering light of the fireplace casting long shadows on the walls. She felt a strange mix of emotions: vindication, sorrow, and an overwhelming sense of loss. Raymond's betrayal had not only shattered her trust, but also reshaped everything she thought she knew about her family. Upstairs, Brandon lay awake in his room, staring at the ceiling. The man who had haunted his fragmented memories was no longer a faceless shadow. He was someone he had seen at family gatherings, someone he should have been able to trust. And now, as the truth settled in, Brandon knew his journey to reclaiming his identity was far from over. The morning after Raymond's arrest, the Reynolds estate was eerily quiet. The staff tiptoed through the halls, their movements subdued as they whispered among themselves. The news of Raymond's betrayal spread quickly, though no one dared bring it up in Martha's presence. The house, once a symbol of elegance and stability, now felt weighed down by the shadows of its unraveling secrets. Martha stood in the conservatory, staring out at the gardens. Her reflection in the glass looked tired, older somehow, as if the weight of the past few days had aged her overnight. The revelation of Raymond's role in Caleb's disappearance had left her grappling with emotions she could barely name: grief for the brother she thought she knew, anger at his selfishness, and a profound sadness for all the years lost. Behind her, Brandon entered quietly. He paused, unsure if he should interrupt her solitude. But Martha, sensing his presence, turned and gave him a small, weary smile. "Good morning," she said softly. "Morning," Brandon replied. His voice hesitant, he stepped closer, his hands shoved into his pockets. "How are you holding up?" Martha exhaled, her shoulders sagging slightly. "I don't know. I keep thinking about Raymond, about everything he did. I can't believe I didn't see it." "It's not your fault," Brandon said firmly. "He hid it well." "Too well," Martha nodded, though the guilt lingered. "And you? How are you feeling?" Brandon hesitated, struggling to articulate the whirlwind of emotions inside him. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "Angry, I guess, at him, at what he did, but also at myself." "At yourself?" Martha's brow furrowed. "Why?" "Because I keep thinking, maybe I should remember more," he said, his voice thick with frustration. "Maybe if I'd tried harder, if I'd figured this out sooner, none of this would have happened." Martha crossed the room and placed a hand on his arm. "None of this is your fault, Caleb," she said gently. "You were just a child, and the fact that you've come this far, that you've survived, it's nothing short of miraculous." Her use of the name Caleb still felt strange to Brandon, but he didn't correct her. Instead, he gave a small nod, though the doubts in his mind remained. Later that afternoon, Carter returned to the estate with new developments. Martha and Brandon met him in the study, their expressions tense as they awaited his report. "I've been going through the evidence we gathered," Carter began, setting a folder on the desk. "The cufflink, the financial records, Raymond's confession, it all points to a larger operation." Raymond wasn't acting alone. Martha's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" "There's evidence that Raymond hired someone, a fixer, to handle the logistics of Caleb's abduction," Carter explained. "We believe this fixer is the one who took Caleb to Chicago and orchestrated his disappearance." Brandon's jaw tightened. "So there's someone else out there who knows what happened to me?" Carter nodded. "Exactly. And if we can find them, we might be able to fill in the gaps in your memory." Martha leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of the desk. "Do you have any leads?" Carter hesitated before pulling out a photograph. It showed a man in his late 50s, with sharp features and cold eyes. "This is Martin Greaves. He's been linked to several similar cases. Abductions, disappearances, all tied to wealthy families. He's a ghost, though. No permanent address, no known associates. But we believe he's still active." Brandon studied the photograph, his hands curling into fists. "How do we find him?" "I've got a few leads," Carter replied. "It's going to take time, but I'm confident we can track him down." In the days that followed, Carter intensified his investigation, while Martha and Brandon tried to navigate the aftermath of Raymond's betrayal. For Martha, the knowledge that her brother's actions were only part of a larger conspiracy was both terrifying and maddening. For Brandon, it reignited a determination to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. One evening, as Brandon wandered the estate, he found himself drawn back to the guest house. It had been cleaned out since their initial visit, but the memories it stirred remained vivid. He stood in the center of the room, closing his eyes as he tried to piece together the fragments of his past. There was the man's voice, low, commanding, the smell of gasoline, the sensation of being dragged, his small hands clawing at the floor, and then, something new, the sound of a phone ringing, a harsh, shrill noise that echoed in his mind. His eyes snapped open, his breathing uneven. The memory was fleeting, but it felt significant. He left the guest house and headed straight for the mansion where he found Martha in the library. "I remembered something," he said, his voice urgent. Martha looked up from her book, her expression concerned. "What is it?" "There was a phone," Brandon said, pacing as he spoke. "I heard it ringing. It was loud, like it was right next to me, and the man, he answered it." "What did he say?" Martha asked, rising from her chair. "I don't know," Brandon admitted, his frustration evident. "I couldn't hear the words, but I remember his voice. It was cold, sharp." Martha placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "That's something, Caleb. It's a piece of the puzzle." Brandon nodded, though his jaw remained tight. "We have to find this guy, Martin Greaves. If he's the one who took me, he has the answers." "We will," Martha assured him. "Whatever it takes, we'll find him." As the evening wore on, Brandon's resolve only grew stronger. The man in his memories was no longer just a shadow. He had a name, a face, and a trail that Carter was determined to follow. And for the first time, Brandon felt a glimmer of hope that the truth, however difficult, was finally within reach. The discovery of Martin Greaves' involvement brought a renewed sense of urgency to the investigation. Carter had promised to follow every lead. But progress was slow. The man was a ghost, slipping through official records and leaving only faint traces of his existence. For Martha and Brandon, the wait was agonizing. Brandon found it increasingly difficult to focus. Every moment felt like a countdown, each day an endless stretch of unanswered questions. The memory of the ringing phone replayed in his mind, haunting him with its urgency. He couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, not just for finding Greaves, but for reclaiming the pieces of himself that still felt lost. One afternoon, while Brandon was working in the garden, he noticed a dark sedan parked just beyond the estate gates. At first, he dismissed it as a delivery vehicle or a neighbor's guest, but as the hours passed, the car remained. Its tinted windows made it impossible to see who was inside. but the faint hum of the engine indicated someone was waiting. Brandon's unease grew. He continued his work, stealing glances at the car, his instincts warning him that something was off. When he finally decided to approach, the car pulled away, its tires crunching on the gravel as it disappeared down the road. He mentioned the incident to Martha over dinner that evening, his voice cautious. "I think someone was watching the estate today." Martha frowned, her fork pausing midair. "Watching? Are you sure?" Brandon nodded. "There was a car parked near the gates for hours. It left when I started walking toward it." Martha's grip on her glass tightened. "Do you think it's connected to Martin Greaves?" "Maybe," Brandon admitted. "Or someone working for him." Martha's eyes darkened with worry. "We need to tell Carter." Carter arrived the next morning, his expression grim as he listened to Brandon's account. He inspected the area near the gates and confirmed fresh tire tracks, but they led nowhere definitive. "This could be Greaves, or someone he's hired to keep tabs on you," Carter said. "Carter," his voice low. "If he knows we're looking for him, he might be trying to stay one step ahead." "What do we do?" Martha asked, her voice tinged with urgency. Carter adjusted his coat, his tone resolute. "We stay vigilant. I'll put someone on watch around the estate, and if this happens again, call me immediately." Despite the precautions, tension within the estate mounted. Brandon couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The staff moved cautiously, whispering among themselves about the strange car and the growing sense of unease that hung over the property. A few days later, Brandon decided to venture into town to clear his mind. He drove to a small cafe he'd visited once before, hoping the change of scenery might provide some relief. But as he sipped his coffee, he noticed a familiar figure sitting at a table near the window. It was the driver of the dark sedan. The man's face was unfamiliar, but his sharp suit and calculated movements screamed professionalism. He was speaking into a phone, his eyes scanning the cafe, when they landed on Brandon. His expression remained neutral, but his gaze lingered just a second too long. Brandon's heart raced. He turned his head, pretending not to notice, but his mind was already racing with possibilities. Should he confront the man? "Leave immediately. Call Carter." As the minutes stretched, Brandon made his decision. He rose from his seat, leaving cash on the table, and walked briskly toward the exit. Once outside, he crossed the street and slipped into a narrow alley, his back pressed against the cold brick wall. He pulled out his phone and called Carter. "There's a man here," he said, his voice low. "I think he's the one who was watching the estate." "Where are you?" Carter asked sharply. Brandon gave him the location. "He's inside the cafe. I didn't confront him, but he saw me." "Good. Stay where you are," Carter instructed. "I'm on my way." Minutes felt like hours as Brandon waited in the alley. His nerves on edge, he glanced around constantly, half expecting the man to appear. When Carter finally arrived, his black SUV pulled up to the curb with precision. "Get in," Carter said, his tone clipped. Brandon climbed into the passenger seat, relief washing over him. "Did you see him?" Carter shook his head. "He's gone. Probably noticed you leaving and decided to slip away." Brandon's jaw tightened. "So, what now?" "He's just out there, watching us." Carter's expression was grim. "It confirms one thing, Greaves, or whoever's behind this, knows we're getting close. They're watching you because they're afraid of what you might remember." Back at the estate, Martha's concern deepened when Carter relayed the incident. The thought of Brandon being followed, possibly targeted, sent a chill down her spine. "We need to find Greaves before he makes another move," she said, her voice firm. Carter nodded. "I've been working some leads. There's a property on the outskirts of the city linked to one of his shell companies. It's a long shot, but it's worth checking out." "I'm going with you," Brandon said immediately. "No," Martha interjected, her tone sharp. "It's too dangerous." Brandon met her gaze, his expression resolute. "I'm not sitting around waiting for someone else to piece my life together. I need to do this." Martha hesitated, her protective instincts warring with the determination she saw in his eyes. Finally, she sighed. "Be careful, both of you." The next day, Carter and Brandon drove to the address, a dilapidated warehouse on the edge of an industrial park. The area was desolate, the faint hum of machinery in the distance, the only sound. They parked a safe distance away and approached cautiously, Carter leading the way. Inside, the warehouse was mostly empty, but signs of recent activity were evident. discarded coffee cups, cigarette butts, and a makeshift desk covered in scattered papers. "This is it," Carter muttered, sifting through the papers. "Greaves has been here." Brandon stepped closer, his eyes scanning the desk. Among the papers was a torn photograph. His breath caught as he recognized it. A picture of himself as a child, holding a toy train. "It's me," he whispered, his hands trembling as he picked up the photo. "He's been watching me for a long time." Carter placed a hand on his shoulder. "This is the break we needed. Now we find him." As they left the warehouse, Brandon's resolve hardened. He was no longer just a victim piecing together his past. He was ready to confront it, no matter the cost. The drive back to the Reynolds estate was heavy with silence. Brandon sat in the passenger seat, clutching the torn photograph of himself as a child. It was frayed at the edges, the image worn from time, but there was no mistaking the bright smile on his face, or the toy train in his small hands. The photo stirred emotions he couldn't quite place. Nostalgia, fear, and anger all tangled together. Carter glanced at him from the driver's seat. "This changes things," he said, breaking the silence. "Greaves didn't just orchestrate your disappearance. He's been keeping tabs on you." Brandon exhaled slowly, his grip tightening on the photo. "But why? What does he want from me?" "That's the question we need to answer," Carter replied. "If he's been watching you all these years, there's a reason. And it's not just about money." Back at the estate, Martha was pacing the length of the study when they arrived. The moment she saw Brandon holding the photo, her breath caught. She took it from him, her hands trembling as she stared at the image. This was taken the day before you disappeared," she whispered. "I remember it. You wouldn't put that train down." Brandon's chest tightened. "Then how does Greaves have it?" Martha looked up, her expression stricken. "He must have taken it from here. That means he wasn't just working for Raymond. He was in this house." The realization sent a chill through the room. Carter set his bag down and unfolded a map on the desk, marking the locations tied to Greaves's shell companies. "We're closing in on him," he said. "The warehouse gave us valuable clues, but it's not enough. He's still out there. And he knows we're looking." Martha straightened, her fear giving way to determination. "So we keep looking, whatever it takes." The next morning, Carter received a tip from one of his informants. A man matching Greaves's description had been spotted in a small motel on the outskirts of the city. Carter wasted no time, gathering his equipment and briefing Brandon and Martha. "This is it," he said. "If he's there, we'll bring him in, but you both need to stay here." "No," Brandon said firmly. "I'm coming with you." Carter shook his head. "It's too dangerous." "I don't care," Brandon shot back. "This is my life we're talking about. I deserve to face him." Martha placed a hand on Brandon's arm, her voice soft but resolute. "You're right, Caleb, but please, be careful." An hour later, Carter and Brandon arrived at the rundown motel. It was a shabby 2-story building with peeling paint and a flickering neon sign. Carter parked a block away, and they approached on foot, keeping to the shadows. Inside, the motel smelled of stale smoke and cheap cleaning products. Carter spoke briefly with the clerk, slipping him some cash for information. The clerk pointed to a room on the second floor, room 214. Carter signaled for Brandon to stay behind as he approached the door, his hand resting on the holster at his side. He knocked firmly. "Room service?" he called, his voice calm but authoritative. There was no response. Carter tried the handle, but it was locked. He nodded to Brandon, who handed him a small crowbar from the car. With a quick motion, Carter forced the door open. The room was empty. It was sparsely furnished. A bed with rumpled sheets, a table with a half-empty coffee cup, and a suitcase partially packed. But it was clear Greaves had been there recently. Carter moved swiftly, searching for anything useful. Brandon stood in the doorway, his eyes scanning the room. On the table, a small notebook caught Brandon's attention. He picked it up, flipping through its pages. It was filled with scrawled notes and addresses, but one entry stood out: Reynolds Estate, complete surveillance. Brandon's blood ran cold. "He's been watching us," he said, holding up the notebook. Carter frowned, taking the notebook from him. "This confirms it. He's been planning something. We need to move fast." Just as they turned to leave, a faint creak echoed from the hallway. Carter drew his weapon, motioning for Brandon to stay behind him. They stepped into the corridor, their footsteps careful and deliberate. A figure emerged from the stairwell, a man with sharp features and piercing eyes. It was Martin Greaves. For a moment, no one moved. Greaves's gaze flicked between Carter and Brandon, a faint smirk curling his lips. "Well," he said, his voice calm and chilling. "I wasn't expecting visitors." "Martin Greaves," Carter said, his tone steady. "You're coming with us." Greaves raised his hands slowly, his expression amused. "And what exactly do you think I've done?" "You know what you've done," Brandon said, his voice shaking with anger. "You took me. You destroyed my life." Greaves's smirk widened. "Destroyed? No, my boy. I gave you a chance." The cryptic statement sent a shiver down Brandon's spine. Before he could respond, Greaves darted toward the stairwell. Carter cursed and gave chase. With Brandon close behind, the chase was chaotic, with Greaves weaving through the narrow halls and out into the parking lot. Carter tackled him just as he reached the edge of the lot, pinning him to the ground. "You're not going anywhere," Carter growled, pulling out handcuffs. Greaves laughed, his voice eerily calm. "You don't even know the half of it." Back at the estate, Greaves was handed over to the authorities, but not before Carter extracted key information during the drive. Greaves admitted to orchestrating Caleb's disappearance, but hinted at a larger conspiracy, a network of powerful individuals who had benefited from his services. As the police car drove away, Martha turned to Brandon, her expression a mix of relief and unease. "It's over," she said softly, but even as the words left her lips, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Brandon stared after the car, his fists clenched. "Not yet," he said. "Not until I understand why." The revelation of Martin Greaves' involvement brought a fleeting sense of relief to the Reynolds estate. For the first time, Martha and Brandon had a tangible target, a man who could answer the questions that had haunted them for over 2 decades. But as the dust settled, the cryptic words Greaves had uttered before his arrest lingered ominously in their minds. "You don't even know the half of it." Carter wasted no time. He spent the night combing through the notebook recovered from Greaves' motel room, cross-referencing its entries with the information he had already gathered. What emerged was a tangled web of connections, each thread leading back to powerful figures whose names were carefully omitted from official records. The next morning, Martha found Carter in the study, the table cluttered with maps, files, and photographs. He looked up as she entered, exhaustion etched into his features. "We're dealing with something much bigger than we thought," Carter began, gesturing to the documents. Greaves wasn't just a freelancer, he was part of a network, an organization that profits from the vulnerabilities of families like yours. Martha's breath caught. What kind of organization? Kidnappings? Blackmail, extortion, Carter explained. They target wealthy families using their connections to exploit power and money. Caleb wasn't the only victim. Martha sank into a chair, her hand covering her mouth. "Are you saying this wasn't just about Raymond?" Carter nodded grimly. "Raymond may have initiated it, but he didn't act alone. This organization facilitated everything. Caleb's abduction, the forged documents, even his placement in the orphanage. They made it impossible for you to find him." Upstairs, Brandon sat in his room, the torn photograph still in his hands. He had replayed Greaves's chilling smirk over and over in his mind, his cryptic words echoing like a taunt. The answers they had uncovered so far felt insufficient, like pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit, determined to confront his past, head on. Brandon made his way downstairs. He found Carter and Martha deep in conversation and interrupted cautiously. "I want to talk to him," Brandon said. His voice steady, Martha frowned. "Talk to who?" "Greaves," Brandon replied. "I need to hear it from him. Why he did it. Why he took me." Carter hesitated, glancing at Martha. "That's not a good idea. He's dangerous, manipulative. He'll say whatever he thinks you want to hear." "I don't care," Brandon insisted. "I need to face him." Martha's instinct was to protect Brandon from any further pain, but she saw the determination in his eyes. After a long pause, she nodded reluctantly. "If this is what you need, I'll support you." The meeting was arranged at the local police station under Carter's careful supervision. Greaves sat behind a steel table, his hands cuffed, his demeanor infuriatingly calm. When Brandon entered the room, flanked by Carter and an officer. Greaves greeted him with a smirk. "Well, if it isn't the lost boy," Greaves drawled. "Come to get your answers." Brandon took a seat across from him, his jaw tight. "Why did you take me?" Greaves leaned back as much as his restraints allowed. "Because I was paid to. Simple as that." "By Raymond," Brandon said, his voice sharp. Greaves chuckled. "Yes, your dear uncle initiated the whole thing. But he wasn't the only one pulling the strings." Brandon's fists clenched. "What do you mean?" "There are people out there, powerful people who profit from chaos," Greaves said, his tone almost conversational. "They use people like me to do their dirty work. Your family was just another mark." Brandon's chest tightened. "And the orphanage. Was that part of the plan?" "Of course," Greaves replied smoothly. "It wasn't about you. You were just a pawn, but you were never supposed to resurface. That was unexpected." Brandon's anger boiled over. "You stole my life." Greaves met his gaze, his expression unflinching. "I gave you a new one." Before Brandon could respond, Carter stepped forward, his tone cutting. "This ends here, Greaves. You've already confessed enough to put yourself away for life. Whatever you're protecting, it won't matter." Greaves smirked again, his eyes cold. "You think you've won. You've barely scratched the surface." Back at the estate, Brandon paced the length of the library, his frustration palpable. The meeting with Greaves had provided some answers, but raised even more questions. The mention of a larger network left him feeling powerless, as though the truth was still out of reach. Martha watched him silently from the doorway, her heart aching for her son. She stepped inside and placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Caleb," she said softly, "you've come so far. Don't lose hope now." "I just want it to be over," Brandon admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I want to know who I am, who I was supposed to be." Martha's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "You are my son. That's all that matters." That evening, as the estate settled into an uneasy quiet, Carter received an urgent call. His contact had uncovered a critical lead, a private estate owned by a shell company connected to Greaves's network. It was secluded, heavily guarded, and likely the hub of their operations. Carter shared the news with Martha and Brandon over a late-night meeting in the study. "This could be it," he said. "The place where everything started, and where it can end." Martha nodded, her resolve hardening. "Then we go." Brandon glanced at her, his expression serious. "We end this, together." As they prepared for the confrontation, the weight of the journey so far settled heavily on all of them. The truth was closer than ever, but the stakes had never been higher. For Brandon, it was a chance to reclaim his stolen identity. For Martha, it was an opportunity to finally bring her family back together. And for Carter, it was the culmination of a relentless pursuit of justice. But none of them could have anticipated the final revelation waiting for them. The morning was crisp and cold, as Carter, Martha, and Brandon prepared to head toward the private estate linked to Martin Greaves's network. The weight of what they were about to uncover loomed over them like a storm cloud. The plan was simple. Carter would lead the approach, using his experience to navigate the estate's defenses, while Martha and Brandon would stay close, ready to confront the truths they had sought for so long. "Are you sure about this?" Martha asked Brandon as they stood by the car, her voice laced with concern. Brandon nodded firmly. "I have to be. I need to know everything." Carter adjusted his gear and joined them, his tone brisk but steady. "We'll move fast. Stay quiet. This place isn't designed for visitors." The drive to the estate was tense, the silence between them heavy with anticipation. The secluded property sat deep in the woods, surrounded by dense trees that seemed to form an impenetrable wall as the car approached the gates. Carter pulled off the road, hiding the vehicle among the underbrush. They continued on foot, moving cautiously toward the imposing iron gates. Beyond them, a sprawling mansion loomed, its high walls and darkened windows giving it an air of foreboding. Security cameras swept the perimeter, their red lights blinking rhythmically. Carter motioned for them to stay back as he disabled the gate's security system. With a faint click, the gates creaked open and they slipped inside. The estate was eerily quiet as they moved through the grounds. Carter led them toward a side entrance, avoiding the main pathways. Inside, the mansion was stark and sterile, with marble floors and towering ceilings that echoed faintly with their footsteps. "This place is more fortress than home," Brandon murmured. his voice barely above a whisper. Martha nodded, her unease growing with every step. What kind of people would live here? The kind who don't want to be found, Carter replied grimly. As they moved deeper into the mansion, they came across a large study. The walls were lined with bookshelves and a massive desk sat in the center, papers and files scattered across its surface. Carter began sifting through the documents, his sharp eyes scanning for anything useful. Look at this, he said, holding up a ledger. Payments, transactions, all tied to the same shell companies we've been tracking. Brandon stepped closer, his gaze narrowing as he read the names listed. One, in particular, caught his attention. Project Phoenix. What's that? He asked, pointing to the entry. Carter's brow furrowed. I don't know, but it's mentioned several times. Whatever it is, it's big. Martha, meanwhile, had discovered a locked drawer in the desk. There's something in here, she said, gesturing to the heavy lock. Carter retrieved a small toolkit from his bag and made quick work of the lock, inside the drawer. They found a folder marked with the same name, Project Phoenix. Opening it, they discovered a series of photographs, including one of Brandon as a child. This is you, Martha whispered, her voice trembling. Brandon stared at the photograph, his stomach twisting. Why do they have this? Carter flipped through the documents, his expression darkening. Because this wasn't just about you, Caleb. This was about control. What do you mean? Brandon asked. These documents detail experiments, psychological manipulation, conditioning, Carter explained. You weren't just taken to hurt your family, you were part of something bigger. Something calculated. Martha's face paled. Experiments on children. Carter nodded. It looks like they were targeting families with influence, using their children as leverage. But in your case, Caleb, it seems they wanted more. Brandon's fists clenched. More? What are you saying? Carter hesitated before continuing. They were grooming you, preparing you for something. I don't know what, but it's clear they had plans. Before they could process the gravity of the revelation, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hall. Carter motioned for them to stay quiet, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon. The door creaked open, and a man stepped inside. It was someone Brandon didn't recognize, but Martha's gasp said everything. Vincent, she whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. The man froze, his sharp features hardening as he recognized her. Martha, he said, his voice low and steady. I didn't expect you to come this far. Vincent, Brandon repeated, his confusion giving way to anger. Who is this? Martha's eyes filled with tears. He was your father's closest friend. He was like family. Vincent's gaze shifted to Brandon, his expression unreadable. And now he's my greatest regret. What are you talking about? Brandon demanded, stepping forward. Vincent sighed, his shoulders sagging slightly. It wasn't supposed to be like this. When Raymond approached me, he said it was just a way to secure the family's future. I didn't know what they'd do to you. You knew, Martha spat, her voice shaking with rage. You knew, and you let it happen. I tried to stop it, Vincent insisted, his tone pleading, but by the time I realized what was really happening, it was too late. They had already taken him. Brandon's chest tightened. Why didn't you tell anyone? Why didn't you stop them? Vincent's gaze dropped, shame flickering across his face. Because I was a coward. I thought I could fix it. But I only made things worse. The room fell into a heavy silence, the weight of Vincent's confession sinking in. Martha's hands trembled as she pointed to the folder on the desk. What is Project Phoenix? Vincent hesitated, his jaw tightening. It was an initiative, a way to mold children into assets, people who could influence the world from the shadows. Brandon's stomach churned. And I was part of this. Vincent nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes, but you were different. You resisted. That's why they abandoned you. Martha stepped closer, her voice cutting through the tension. Who are they? Who's behind this? Vincent's lips pressed into a thin line. I don't know their names. They're ghosts, untouchable, but their reach is everywhere. The gravity of Vincent's words hung in the air as Carter stepped forward, his tone sharp. You're coming with us. If you want redemption, you'll start by helping us dismantle this operation. Vincent nodded, his shoulders sagging in defeat. I'll do what I can. As they left the estate, Brandon's mind raced with the weight of the revelations. The organization that had taken him wasn't just a shadow of the past. It was a living, breathing entity with its claws still deeply rooted in the world. But for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. They had a lead. They had Vincent. And they were one step closer to uncovering the full truth. The return to the Reynolds estate was silent, each person lost in their thoughts. Vincent's confession had shattered the fragile clarity they'd gained, revealing an intricate and chilling conspiracy that stretched far beyond anything they had imagined. For Brandon, the weight of his stolen identity pressed heavier than ever, but the pieces were finally beginning to fit together. As the group convened in the study, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Carter spread the documents they had recovered across the table, his sharp eyes scanning for overlooked details. "Vincent," Carter began, his tone firm but measured, "if you want any chance at redemption, we need everything you know. No more half-truths." Vincent sat across from him, his hands clasped tightly. He looked older now, the weight of his guilt etched deeply into his features. "I'll tell you everything," he said quietly. Over the next hour, Vincent unraveled the tangled web of Project Phoenix. The organization, he explained, was a clandestine group of power brokers, corporate magnates, politicians, and shadowy figures who operated beyond the reach of law. They sought to shape the world through influence, manipulation, and control, using children from influential families as pawns in their schemes. They believed in grooming assets from a young age, Vincent said, his voice steady but heavy with remorse. The idea was to create individuals who could infiltrate any sector, government, business, media, without raising suspicion. Caleb was unique. They saw potential in him. Brandon's jaw tightened. "Why me?" Vincent hesitated before answering. "Your intelligence, your adaptability. It stood out. Even at 5 years old, they wanted to mold you into something greater. But you resisted. You were too independent. Too defiant eventually. They deemed you a failure and abandoned the project." Martha's hands trembled as she listened. "And you let this happen." "I didn't know what they were doing at first," Vincent admitted. "Raymond brought me in, saying it was just about securing the family's legacy. By the time I realized the truth, it was too late to stop them. I tried to protect you, Caleb. I tried to undo what I had helped set in motion. By letting them dump me in an orphanage." Brandon snapped, his voice thick with anger. "That's your idea of protection." Vincent's gaze dropped. "I thought it was better than the alternative. If they'd kept you, you'd have been destroyed." As the hours wore on, Carter pieced together the information Vincent provided. The documents from the estate offered corroboration: financial records, coded communications, and vague references to high-profile individuals connected to the project. It was damning evidence, but it was incomplete. "There's one name that keeps coming up," Carter said, pointing to a recurring entry in the ledger, Blackthorn Initiative. "This could be the key." Vincent's face darkened. "Blackthorn is their central hub. It's where they orchestrate everything." "Where is it?" Martha asked. "It's not a place," Vincent said grimly. "It's a network, a digital infrastructure that ties their operations together. If you want to dismantle them, you have to take down Blackthorn." Carter leaned back, his expression contemplative. "We'll need help. This kind of operation requires resources and expertise." "I know someone," Vincent offered cautiously. "A former associate of mine. They left the organization years ago and went underground, but they might still have access." Over the next several days, the group worked tirelessly to locate Vincent's contact, a hacker known only as Spectre. When they finally made contact, Spectre agreed to help. Though their mistrust of Vincent was palpable, Spectre's expertise proved invaluable. With their guidance, the group uncovered the location of a hidden Blackthorn server facility, a nondescript office building in the heart of the city. It was the linchpin of the organization, housing encrypted records that could expose its members and operations. "This is it," Carter said, gathering the team for a final briefing. "We take down the servers, and we expose the entire network. But it won't be easy. They'll have security measures in place." "I'm going," Brandon said firmly. Martha's heart sank. "Caleb, you've done enough. Let us handle this." "No," Brandon insisted. "This is my fight. I need to see it through." The operation was planned with precision. Carter, Brandon, and Spectre infiltrated the facility under the cover of night, using forged credentials to bypass initial security. Inside, the building was stark and modern, its sterile hallways illuminated by cold fluorescent lights. Spectre guided them to the server room, their fingers flying across a handheld device to disable firewalls and alarms. When they reached the room, rows of humming servers greeted them, their blinking lights casting an eerie glow. "This is it," Spectre said. "Give me a few minutes," as Spectre worked. Carter and Brandon kept watch, but their presence hadn't gone unnoticed. Alarms blared suddenly, and the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the halls. "They're onto us," Carter said, drawing his weapon. "Brandon, stay behind me." Guards poured into the room, their shouts drowned out by the chaos. Carter and Brandon fought to hold them off, their movements precise and determined. Despite the odds, they managed to buy Spectre enough time to finish the upload. "We've got it!" Spectre shouted. "Let's move!" The group fled the facility, narrowly escaping as reinforcements arrived. Back at their safe house, Spectre revealed the files they had extracted, names, accounts, and communications that exposed the organization's leadership. The fallout was swift and far-reaching. Media outlets broke the story within days, the scandal rocking the foundations of the elite circles that had quietly controlled so much of the world. Arrests were made, assets seized, and the shadowy network that had stolen Brandon's life began to crumble. For Brandon, the victory was bittersweet. The truth had been revealed, but the scars of the past remained as he stood on the balcony of the Reynolds estate, looking out over the gardens. Martha joined him. "You did it," she said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You took back your life." Brandon nodded, though his gaze remained distant. "It doesn't change what happened, but at least now it's over." Martha turned him toward her, her eyes filled with pride and love. "You're home." "Caleb, that's what matters." Brandon smiled faintly. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace. The past would always be a part of him, but the future was his to shape. Epilogue months later, Brandon took on a new role at the estate, helping oversee the family's philanthropic efforts. Carter continued his work as a private investigator, though he remained a close friend of the family. Vincent, having cooperated fully with the investigation, sought quiet redemption away from public scrutiny. As the seasons changed, the Reynolds estate began to feel like home again, for Brandon and Martha. The journey had been painful, but it had forged a bond that nothing could break, and for the first time in 22 years, the Reynolds family felt whole.